Welcome to session 7, the final session on the terrestrial protected areas of Sri Lanka. I will now wait for John to join us and hopefully we can get started. Just connecting. This is connected. All right, so I was just telling everyone we are doing session 7, the final session on the protected areas, terrestrial protected areas of Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Today we will be talking about the North Western province of the country. And give it just a moment and we can get started.
So just for everybody who's just joined just now, we'll be talking about 4 clusters of protected areas today. We'll be talking about the Wilpattu Forest Complex, which has come up, quite recently in many news articles and media regarding the destruction and the general love that people have for Wilpattu National Park, which is at the heart of that cluster. Then we'll talk about the Sacred City Protected Area Ring, which basically surrounds Anuradhapura city. Then there's the Chilaw, Puttalam, Kurunegala cluster of protected areas. And finally, the general northwestern human-elephant conflict zones around Galgaon. So those 4 clusters will be the focus of today's session.
And make it easier, we can show it even on the map. So let me get it on. So basically, we'll be talking about this section. And then let me just zoom in. All right, and so that would be the Wilpattu Forest Complex.
Yep.
Then the Sacred City and the surrounding protected areas are these cluster here. Yep. And then down towards Negombo is the Puttalam, Chilaw section, and Kurunegala up towards this way. And then the elephant corridor is just this whole, or the conflict zone is all of this, basically the movement happening through these areas. So those will be the 4 topics that we talk about.
And it's interesting to note that even in this session, the protected areas that we cover are largely featured in the northwestern province, which is 7,888 square kilometers of the island. So it's a considerable chunk. And then the remnant protected areas in the north of Wilpattu National Park itself fall in the southern portion of the Mannar District in the northern province. So there's quite a lot today.
All right. So let's get started. We'll start with probably Chilaw, Puttalam and move up towards Kurunegala and then move into it from there.
Yeah.
All right. So when we talk about from Negombo even upwards, just when you leave Colombo and come up towards Negombo, from there onwards, there are all these small protected areas, like are scattered. Again, easy if I bring it up. All these little dots that you see in this map, even when you look at it on satellite imagery, you see it better. Are all the protected areas that go from Negombo upwards. And all of these are extremely important for small animals, especially reptiles, birds, because you don't get the larger fauna in this area because it is highly developed moving up towards Puttalam. But it still is, there are lots of sanctuaries there that are well known for its birding aspects.
And what's interesting about that particular cluster, I guess it's important to specify for everybody who's watching today, that cluster of protected areas, the southernmost extent would be considered the Dankotua area. So in that sense, it covers not just the dry zone of Sri Lanka, but a section of the intermediate zone as well. So like the northernmost areas of the southwestern biodiversity supercluster protected areas where our lowland tropical rainforests are, these are isolated protected area patches and chunks, which still contain, as Riahn said earlier, a significant amount of ecological diversity in terms of small fauna, so mammals, reptiles, avian fauna, but at the same time, they still contain also these remnant ecosystems that are very important for future conservation efforts. So it's more important than most people would realize, which I'm sure you would agree with as well.
I think that relates well with our first session where we spoke about the small patches that are even in the outskirts of Colombo and in Colombo. So just like that, in these areas, that is how these protected areas tie into things. The smaller fauna and the balance that this gives to them and the protection it gives to them is what happens in these smaller protected areas from, like you said, Danko to up towards Puttalam.
Yeah. And even on the Kurunegala side, if I can give an example, once you pass through Kurunegala town, I don't know whether many people have noticed, but on your way to Dambulla and towards Habrana, you pass through a small protected forest patch, which is known as the Badagamla Conservation Forest. And that particular conservation forest is a key example of this remnant style of ecosystem. Now, there are a lot of invasive species I've noticed in Badagamo as well, because it hasn't been as effectively managed as it could have been. It's under the Department of Forest Conservation. I mean, that's the mandated authority. But in that sense, if we can start opening people's eyes and showing and giving awareness that these protected areas matter in terms of ecological diversity in isolated chunks, then I really think we have a step forward in the right direction. And I hope that example is one that will, give people the opportunity to explore that concept further.
Yeah. And again, 17 of these are conservation forests, which is Tier 1A. So that just shows the importance of them. But unfortunately, because they happen to be so small, there is a lot of destruction and movement of human through this, even though technically a conservation forest is one of the higher levels of protected areas.
Absolutely.
All right, so from that we can move up in towards, maybe we'll move to the sacred city. From Kurunegala, take that road towards the sacred city.
Yeah. So what I find interesting about this is that a lot of these protected areas that surround the sacred city of Anuradhapura are quite old. Many of the DFC protected areas, such as National Reserve Forest, date back to the 1920s. And some of the wildlife sanctuaries, they actually have a really interesting history in the sense that, let's take one of the wildlife sanctuaries, for example, Mihintale. Mihintale actually has I guess it would be considered an honor in one sense, of being considered the oldest wildlife sanctuary in existence, at least according to certain stories, shall we say. Because now the thing is, Mihintale hasn't actually remained a wildlife sanctuary indefinitely for the past 2,000 years. But the basic story behind it is that our kings of the ancient times declared it a wildlife sanctuary 2,000 years ago. And more recently, in the 1930s, it was redeclared as a wildlife sanctuary and still remains as such. So even around, a sacred city with significant religious and cultural aspects such as Anuradhapura, there are still protected areas that almost encircle the city in a ring. And that's of quite big importance, I would say. So if we look
That's mainly this section. You can see there's so many clusters of green around this area, and that is in where all this falls in. Yeah. So all that greenery there becomes extremely important.
And remember that
this is A12 that goes across here towards Anuradhapura.
And remember, this is significant wild elephant territory. So there are still large herds of wild elephants moving, not only in these protected areas, but in the unprotected wildernesses and agricultural lands that are adjacent to these protected areas. So there is importance in this. We just have to.
And by saying that, that's where we can tie it into the northwestern human elephant conflict zone. That is where it ties in, because all these protected areas fall under that. That's what my take is, because I would say the elephant corridors and elephant movement happens from Wilpattu and then filters down through these protected areas that are scattered in that Tabover region and down towards Anuradhapura, because there is a lot of movement from what we know.
And what's important to realize is that at one point, a lot of these protected areas would have been all contiguous with each other. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot more fragmentation, but there is still a chance to secure those areas for the betterment of wild elephants. So
yeah, when we look at satellite imagery, you see that, because there's a lot of cultivation happening, and you see these becoming extremely patchy because all of the forest cover is cut for cultivation activities. And that is what is seen on satellite imagery, unfortunately.
Yeah, so that is actually one of the reasons why in that region, especially around Galgamu and even in the Anuradhapura Malwattua region, we do see a significant rise in human-elephant conflict numbers on a daily basis. I would say, based on the research that has been done by reputed individuals in the conservation community and entities such as, for example, the CCR, the Center for Conservation Research, Galgamu is probably one of the worst instances of human-elephant conflict in Sri Lanka, or a place where it's occurring. So there is a lot of scope for potentially addressing that and bringing about a positive change in these areas.
And again, it ties into what we've been talking about throughout these sessions, land use. Because when you do have farmland around wild elephants, it is almost written in the books that this is going to happen. So we need to learn from that and then come up with better planning strategies.
And, let's be, in the most realistic sense, wild elephants do actually take up significant amounts of food. So if we end up being the causal factor for wiping out the protected areas that they need to graze and roam around in, then inevitably we are speeding up instances of human-elephant conflict. It's all interlinked. And I think in that sense, it's important that awareness is built so that we can fully understand the ramifications of our actions and take positive steps to ensure that protected areas remain intact, just to ensure that wild elephants don't get into increased instances of human-elephant conflict, because that doesn't serve to benefit anyone,
And
as you and I.
I say, in adding to that point, the A12 that cuts across from Puttalam towards Anuradhapura, where we were talking about earlier, towards Kalawava and all that, just on that road, the surroundings, there's elephants moving around so much. And do we have a question up there?
So
we will talk about that maybe at the end of the session. We'll get to that.
We'll get to that,
Yeah, so then moving into Wilpattu. So Wilpattu, it's the one national park in this area. But more than Wilpattu as a individual park, it is all the protected areas in the north as well as the protected areas in the south. Because on the west of the park, it's more developed, and that's the road that goes to Mannar. But those two zones on either side of the park is what provides that protection for Wilpattu as a national park. But it's one that's not spoken about enough, and it's one that's probably not known about enough as well. So that is what we would focus on mainly in this session today. What would you want to say on that?
No, so you're absolutely right. So for example, if we bring up the map again, the protected areas that are directly north of Wilpattu National Park. Now, for our audience who has tuned in today, a lot of those protected areas directly north of the park, as Riahn is showing you now, those are actually the protected areas that have been affected by the recent instances of deforestation that have been showcased in the media. Now, for example, if I was to give you examples of names of these protected areas, they would be Marichikaddikaradakulli Kallaru, Vilattikulam, and Veppal. Those would be the key three big ones. But there are other ones such as Periyamuripu, Maavillu, Periyakuriyakuttikulam. Those protected areas are not Wilpattu National Park. These are all Department of Forest Conservation protected areas, so they are independent of the park. Yes, they provide a contiguous habitat for wildlife to move back and forth between Wilpattu National Park and these protected areas directly to the north of it, but they are not actually part of the park. There's a common misconception.
So if you really look at it, the park is that, and then there's a little flag-like piece that goes up there, and then this zone, and then it stops here somewhere.
Yeah.
Everything here and everything down here is other protected areas outside the national park.
Yeah, and make no mistake, there is a lot of deforestation happening in those areas. So if you highlight, Riahn, the southern bit, south of the park, that big chunk there is the Thabboa Wildlife Sanctuary, or part of it, as well as the Veerakulli Cholli Eluvankulam National Reserve Forest.
Now, so Veerakulli Cholli Eluvankulam will be this base area that almost directly connects, and then it moves down into Thabboa, which is closer to the A12.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this is Veerakulli Cholli Eluvankulam is an interesting example of where conservation should have taken precedence, but it didn't, because when they originally proposed Veerakulli Cholli Eluvankulam as a national reserve forest under the Department of Forest Conservation, the extent that they planned to gazette was 310 square kilometers. But I was actually just having a look at the gazette for Veerakulli Cholli Eluvankulam, which was released in 2013, and actually when you look at it, it got reduced by almost 100 square kilometers to 220 square kilometers instead of the 310 that they started out with. And if you look at the satellite imagery, anybody can do this. Just go on Google Maps and have a look at the satellite imagery. You will actually see that there is organized destruction from agricultural and settlement encroachment into that area, despite it being a high-density elephant populated area. So in that regard, there has to be a lot more action taken. And this is something we've talked about a lot before. The working of the DWC and DFC, making sure that they work together to come up with mutually beneficial solutions.
And that's where
it's all linked.
There's a sort of discrepancy, because the DWC only has a small portion if you really look at it, because Wilpattu being a big chunk of it. The DFC has control over most of this area because it falls under them. So there is the importance of these two departments working together and coming up with plans that convey, and the message goes. So their plan is, the end goal is the same thing. There has to be conversation and planning between these two, and they work to that plan and that goal.
Yeah, because now there's actually an instance, show them on the map. Everything south of the A12 has actually been included in a new project that the DFC is planning to open soon, which is known as the Galvilla Ecological or Eco Park, which I mentioned once before when we talked about Hurulu in this context. And this would be the perfect area by which the DWC and DFC can finally come together and start working on joint management plans for the benefit of wildlife conservation in that Wilpattu Forest Complex area. But it only starts if the two government entities start working together. Now, based on what you've seen, Riahn, what would you say that would entail for the future of Wilpattu National Park, based on your experiences in the park?
Well, like I was saying earlier, I think the most important thing for Wilpattu becomes the northern protected areas that surround it, as well as the southern area. Because all activity that takes place, illegal activity within the park, filters in from these zones, unfortunately. So if proper management is put into place for these zones, and there's a collaboration and the two departments working together, they can definitely stop things like this happening.
Yeah. So we have another question.
Which plan exactly?
So I think they're asking in the context of Galvilla.
Yeah, which maybe just clarify that point. Which plan specifically are you talking about? The Galvilla plan or the surrounding areas, or the plan of them working together?
Yeah, but I mean, it still brings up an interesting point that we need to look at mutually beneficial solutions for everybody, because ultimately economic incentives are the one thing that will save protected areas and keep them operational. I mean, we've realized that by now.
Yeah, that is one of the big driving factors. The Galvilla, okay.
Yeah. So basically the idea of Galvilla is to basically utilize the existing protected areas that Galvilla is built upon. So much like the Hurulu Ecological Park is built upon the foundations of the Hurulu Conservation Forest subsequent to its gazette in 2012, in a similar manner, the Galvilla Ecological Park builds on the foundations of two existing protected areas, namely the Thabboa Wildlife Sanctuary and the Wanni Entrances National Reserve Forest. So in that sense, it means now, for example, you've just said that the DFC and DWC plan I was talking about. So part of that plan is to basically understand and collaborate to ensure that the existing protected areas are utilized under Galvilla, because Galvilla will be the ultimate entity that ensures that the DWC and DFC are pushing this conservation initiative with ecotourism. And it makes it so that they show that they are finally working together for solutions that benefit both parties, because otherwise they're constantly arguing with each other and it doesn't benefit anybody.
Yeah, but what I would add on to that, what I think you were trying to say is how the DWC, that's where the DFC can talk to the DWC and get information, because opening this Galvilla so close to Wilpattu, they can get information on how to better market and how to better manage the land in that area. Yeah. And also Galvilla, like you said, it's to give another option other than Wilpattu from the DFC point of view, and maybe try and reduce the pressures on visitation happening in Wilpattu, just like Hurulu does. So it's just to give that other option, and through visitation, there is a lot that comes towards the protection, because you can get the funding and all of that. So all of those things tie in together. So the plan would be to try and get the two departments to work together and then get to that end goal again, as we say, which is conservation of our protected areas.
And it also brings a certain level of awareness, I would add on to that, since most people wouldn't know about protected areas such as Wanni Entrances, Thabboa, Sella, Kandal, Veerakulli, Cholelu, Wankulam, until these protected areas are open to the general public for the purpose of eco. So by opening Galvilla for ecotourism purposes, you are basically indirectly spreading the awareness that you intend to spread, and at the same time utilizing these protected areas for economic benefits for local communities as well, which is a very important part of it.
That is where the planning has to tie in well. It has to be properly planned and properly managed, because you don't want it to go out of control. While awareness is important and visitation important, it needs to be properly planned and properly managed. And that's where the DWC can lend a hand, because they've been doing it for so long.
Yeah. And it also, if I can add even one more point to that, which is an angle that most people don't normally think about, the resource extraction and utilization of basic sustenance in these areas is quite severe, to the point where it's actually degrading ecosystems faster than they can actually recover from the initial investment that is being put into it. So in this manner, if we can keep at least part of the existing network that is outside Wilpattu National Park itself safe, then we can not only ensure that people appreciate it for what it is, instead of just seeing it as simple sustenance and resource extraction, but at the same time, it also allows us to spread awareness that these protected areas contain, number one, significant ecological diversity, number two, key archaeological sites of cultural importance to our island heritage, and number three, provide an economic alternative to basic resource extraction, which is also very important in the grand scale of things.
I think that's one of the things that we have been trying to cover through these sessions, that importance of awareness and letting people know these things exist, and just the ability to explore, because if they're not open to the public, they can't explore these things. So all of that ties in. So now we can maybe move up in towards Wilpattu and talk about Wilpattu in general when we come to the end of this session.
So our biggest national park, 1,317 square kilometers, and our biggest protected area as well. What would you say, Riahn, based on your experiences growing up in that region?
I'm a little biased when it comes to Wilpattu. That would be an understatement. But yeah, it's one of my favorite places to visit. And I've been doing that for as long as I can remember, and as long as it has been permitted, because the war was up there and the park did close. But just the way things are managed, it's a large park. Like you said, it is our biggest national park. So managing such a large national park is difficult. So that is where I was talking about the other protected areas, creating that protection, extra added protection. So everything filters into the importance and how we can protect Wilpattu. So from my experience, I would say Wilpattu is a great national park to visit. And it is one that, again, the planning and management is extremely important.
And I very much must agree with that, because the management aspect of Wilpattu is something that very few people take into consideration, despite the fact that Wilpattu, there's very few people who are actually aware of this, but Wilpattu National Park actually has, officially, it has 6 entrances that have been officially recognized for the park itself. Now, as of right now, only 3 of those entrances are actually open to
I
the
would say
public.
only 2 properly active for the public.
Wait,
the
yes.
third one does come into effect, yeah.
Yeah,
Very
so
right.
in that sense, the main entrance at Kurunegala and the secondary entrance at Eluwankulam are only the ones that are ever really utilized. But it really provides a scope and scale understanding that if ecotourism was to take off and be managed in the appropriate manner, then there are certain parts of Wilpattu that could be only accessed from certain entrances, and that would provide quite a unique scope in terms of diversity, because
Wilpattu is so diverse. It's such a large park. It's like all the blocks of Yala don't make up, it does, but the diversity, because there's a coast, and then the aspect towards Hunuvilgama, how it becomes extra forested, and then the Willu ecosystem. So it's a combination of Kumana, Yala Block 3, all of that tied into this park. So all of that becomes extremely important, and the proper management of these resources.
And those villus, these are natural sand rim depressions or natural lakes. They're one of the most unique ecosystems in the country. What can you tell our audience today about the ecological diversity that you find in the vicinity of those villus in the park?
But forget in the vicinity, just the villus in themselves. There's so much. There's a marine life within those villus. All of that, it becomes extremely important. And then all the grass that is fed from these villus, and when they're full, when after the rains, after the monsoon, the villus fill up, and then when they dry out, the grasses are fed by that water that dries out into the land, and from that all birds, the deer and all of that, and then that ties into the leopards and all of that. So they're extremely important for Wilpattu.
Yeah, so we have another question.
Puttalam Lagoon. There is access to the Puttalam Lagoon, and that's through Gangewadi, I think, more lower on. So
which is an interesting point to address, because what I don't think many people realize is the Wilpattu National Park has a proposed buffer zone that was never actually officially gazetted into existence. And through that, on the Gangewadi side, they actually recently gazetted the Gangewadi Conservation Forest. That official gazette hasn't actually been released yet, but that was actually put under the DFC. So the DFC actually has a chunk of that existing buffer zone, since the DWC never bothered to do anything about it. But if they were to open up Puttalam Lagoon, then that
would fall somewhere.
Forest, it would provide a direct avenue by which people could enter through the Gangewadi Conservation Forest and enter the Puttalam Lagoon for ecotourism related activities, if that is their plan. But
so Gangewadi, again, just to add on to that, is just here, and that is where the Gangewadi Conservation Forest, recently gazetted, comes into effect. And from there, because that's where the Chilaw, and you cross the Chilaw, if anyone's gone in through the secondary entrance, you cross it to go into the park from this side. So that is the access that would go into the Puttalam Lagoon. But again, if you are doing things like that and all, the management becomes extremely important, because it's such a sensitive ecosystem. So there has to be proper educated EIAs done, and then the plan put into place, and the implementation becomes extremely important. So it is probably something that can be looked at, but again, it's very sensitive, so done properly.
And that's definitely something we will address next time in our marine protected area segment, because the Puttalam Lagoon actually falls under a managed fishery area under the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources.
Maybe if lots of people would have seen it on the map, actually, because Wilpattu does fall into that. So that becomes important. So if we can find a way of protecting this zone as well, that's what would come in from that, going into the Puttalam Lagoon. But we will save that for probably our final session, which we have decided to do. And we are coming to the end of today's session. But anything you want to add on to any of these areas that we spoke about, or any other questions that maybe we can talk about? Ishan's question early on, which was, what are your thoughts on the recent leopards trapped in snares? Well, regarding that, it has been happening, but this curfew has created a blanket as such, and then you can't really blame the people. That's another part of the question he's asked, because these are people who are extremely poor, and they're finding a way to eat. So they're not targeting leopard as such, I would say, in those areas. But the leopard is caught in a snare, and it is one of the most deadly, because if you've seen a snare, it's a piece of wire, and it gets wrapped around the leopard, and it just tightens every time they try to escape. And then when people crowd around it, they get even more stressed out and then start struggling to escape. But that causes that snare to tighten even more. So it's quite graphic and quite sad. And it affects them internally as well as externally. So what can be done is maybe tell the estate managers and the estate management to try and go around their estates and find and maybe help their people who are working on these estates to try and avoid them having to turn to snaring and trap guns. But you always get those few people that want to go out there and do it, even though. And then the penalties and the proper implementation of maybe rules and regulations, all of that ties into it. It's something that we can talk about for a long time. It is a sad situation, but hopefully it'll cause people to rally around and maybe help develop our conservation and help our government come up with proper rules and regulations that are needed. So that's my take on it.
And unfortunately, just to add on to that, it is a multi-stakeholder issue. So until we get all parties involved doing the work that they need to do to ensure that this conflict is stemmed at the source, this will keep happening. Now, for example, the Department of Wildlife Conservation, the DWC, they have yet to gazette or yet to officially demarcate the boundaries for peak wilderness. And peak wilderness is our 6th largest wildlife sanctuary, as I mentioned in the Central Highlands episode. It's 224 square kilometers. So the DWC has the responsibility to properly demarcate and officiate the boundaries of peak wilderness. Then the divisional secretariats for Nuwara and adjacent districts in the Central Highlands have a responsibility to encourage the plantation companies to start educating their people on snare traps. The Department of Forest Conservation has its own mandate to play. So there is scope for a multi-stakeholder based consultation in which this can be addressed. But until that happens, this will keep occurring, these incidents. So yes, we can address it, but we also need to do it in a manner that everybody is included and everybody understands what they are buying into. That would be my 2 cents on it.
Anyway, all we can do is hope the proper thing happens now with the sad situation that has arisen due to this. But it is something that has been happening, and hopefully it's not just the snares as well. There's a lot of other aspects, and it all ties into the conflict and encroachment. And so hopefully something will be done from this situation. And anyway, our final session for this awareness program that we have been conducting will be the marine. We've been talking about terrestrial protected areas not being talked about enough, but then marine is almost not talked about if you look at it in that sense. So hopefully it will gloss over them, because it is a very small topic, unfortunately, in terms of Sri Lankan marine protected areas. So hopefully we'll do one session on that and then bring this to a close, and hopefully you all have enjoyed this anyway. And we'll see you on Friday for that session.
Yeah, and just to give one final point as we close down, Sri Lanka's marine protected areas is an area that has become overcomplicated in recent times due to the excess amount of scientific work that has been done, which is vital to keep these marine protected areas intact, but it also has to be summarized in a manner that local people and everyday people can understand. then more people will be involved, hopefully, in our marine protected area work. But, as Riahn said, that marine protected area segment will be the last section from our series. That will be session 8, and session 7 today was the last of the terrestrial protected areas. But, as always, we hope that everybody has enjoyed, and we will see you guys on Friday for Sri Lanka's marine protected areas.
All right. See you then.
See you then.